Okay, in this tutorial we're going to actually talk about working with a photo. To clean it up a little bit and to make it look a little nicer, we're going to talk about something basic like color correction and working with lighting, but then we're also going to talk about some basic airbrushing techniques as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we get moving in this, one of the first things we want to make sure we do is preserve the original image. Now, to do this, what we want to do is go back into our layer palette, find the original layer, and then what we want to do is called duplicate it. It's called, in order to duplicate this, what we want to do is control click or right click on the layer and then just go to duplicate layer. What this does is create a secondary layer that we will actually work with, and then we can always refer back to the original if we need to. This is a good practice to get into anytime we're working with an original image. If we're going to clean it up, if we're going to airbrush it, if we're going to do anything like create virtual makeup or do any kind of this post-production work on a photo, it's a good thing to preserve the original just in case we ever need to come back to it. It's a lot easier than trying to go back in and pull in an original later on, and we don't run the risk of actually messing up the original image. So we've made our duplicate. Now I'm going to turn off auto select so that we don't click on anything that we don't want to. Now I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of things about this image first, and we'll play around with this. First and foremost, what I'd like to do is go in and up at the top of the screen, and I'm not sure that you guys can see this currently, you should see an option for layers, for images. Under images, and I think this is just off your screen, under images you should see adjustments. Image adjustments. Under adjustments, you see a variety of different image adjustment tools. The one that I'm going to work with, the one that I like to work with first, is called levels. I'm going to turn that on. Now, this gives us what's called a histogram, essentially a graphic, a chart that shows us kind of where the colors are. Now, according to this, we've got shadows, midtones, and highlights. Now, according to the histogram, most of our colors are actually in the upper register. They're somewhere between the midtone and the highlight, which you can tell by looking at this. There's not a lot of darkness in this. So if we actually upped the darkness, if we upped the shadows, what we end up seeing is that we take the shadow part, the point for the shadow, and we actually move it closer, which then makes all the colors a little bit more dramatic. Now, if we went crazy, you'd see that it'd even become more dramatic than that. But if we just wanted to make this a little bit less washed out, what we may do is move the shadow slider just a little bit to the right. Now, you can see that this actually does emphasize things like, say, the creases in her face. So, if we really wanted to try and emphasize this, say, the age of our subject, what we may want to do is, as I said, increase the shadow point. Now, we could adjust the midtones as well. Again, if we move the midtones to the right, we emphasize the shadows. If we move to the left, we're actually going to emphasize the highlights, add more range to the highlights. So essentially, the more space between the shadow and the midtone, the more emphasis there is there. More shadow space between the highlight and the midtone, the more space there is there. So you can see we can actually make our images more dramatic in a variety of ways. Now, depending on the skin tone of a person, whether it's light or dark skinned, we may want to adjust the midtones higher or lower. I usually use the midtones as a way of adjusting, say, the detail in someone's skin. So, it's not bad. We can also adjust the highlights. So, for example, if someone was blowing out, they were just too bright, we could adjust the highlights down a bit. I'm sorry, they were just a little bit too dark, rather. We could adjust the highlights down a bit, and this would brighten up the image some. Okay, so this is usually where I start. If I see that I've got a very dark image, what I might see is no levels over here in the highs, and I might need to move this slider to the left until I get just to the beginning of where my histogram starts. Over here you can tell I have very little darks, so what I may want to do is move my slider to the right to get into some more of this color range, okay, and then adjust the midtones accordingly. So that's actually pretty good, I think. Gives us a lot of detail in this picture to work with. We hit OK to lock it in. Okay, so if we have like original, emphasized, original, the one we've emphasized. So now that we've got this, what we can do is actually we could adjust some color in here if we wanted to. Again, we would go under image, go down, and I'm just going to go into hue and saturation. Hue and saturation this time. Again, with this layer selected, we'll look under hue and saturation. Hue adjusts the color. If I move this around, you'll see that we actually are going to be changing the overall color of this image. It's pretty dramatic. Let me just put that back to 0. Boom. Oh, gonna back that out. Open this back up. Adjustment, hue and saturation. If I wanted to choose a particular type of color, for example, reds, yellows, greens, cyans, I could do that as well. So if I wanted to just tweak this a little bit to the yellow or a little bit to the blue, I could do this. For example, if I'm trying to color correct my image, if, for example, my photo is a little bit more blue than I wanted to, maybe I didn't color correct my camera or color balance my camera while I was taking that shot, I could tweak this just a little bit here to help adjust that. If I was doing a project and I actually wanted to, say, create, and I'm going to go kind of crazy here, but I wanted to create kind of a more sterile look, what I could do is adjust more toward like the blue range, or maybe the purple range. This would create that more sterile, kind of medicinal, cold look on this image. Could do the same sort of thing with warmth. Just add a little bit more warmth to the picture. But I don't want to go crazy, or it's going to get you're going to have aliens and strange things happening, irradiated old ladies. So this is all about nuance. Now, hue is okay. Saturation I work with more than anything. Saturation allows you to essentially take the colors you have and build on those. Now, oversaturation, you're going to have essentially glowing colors. But by just tweaking saturation just a bit, or even better, going into specific types of colors, like, say, if I want a red, and just tweak the reds by themselves, you can really bring out certain colors in your design. The flip side is if I remove saturation, for example, if I remove all the reds from this color, all that I'm left with are greens and blues, which creates a very dramatic and kind of scary looking color here. If I wanted to remove, say, all the greens, well, there's not a whole heck of a lot of green in this shot. Let's say I'm going to take the cyans out, see what that does. Okay, so you see that her jacket disappears, but her skin tones are pretty much in the yellows and red mark. So we have the ability to emphasize or de-emphasize certain colors here. Lightness only deals with the relative brightness of the colors themselves. Now again, we're only working with cyans. If I go to master, you'll see that it washes out, or it creates more darkness throughout the whole picture. Okay, so that's one of the tools that I will use quite a bit, actually. You can use color balance if you want, which is actually kind of fun. Do the same sort of thing. Do we want to skew toward the cyan, toward the red, magenta or green, yellow or blue? We can get some very interesting things. There's a variety of other tools under this adjustments that you can play around with. Even if I wanted to do shorthand, for example, just make the whole thing black and white, I could do that and essentially bring out specific color ranges. Now, since this is a very red picture anyway, by emphasizing the reds, I get much more dramatic image of these wrinkles. You can see how that pulls out. So there's any number of things we can do with just adjustment tools under image. Okay, let's jump forward into some of the basic airbrushing tools before this gets any longer than it absolutely has to be. All right, so one of the more simple airbrushing tools that we can use is essentially the spot healing brush. It's under here, under the eyedropper tool. There's several different tools we're going to use. Spot healing is one of the simple ones. If we were to zoom in on, let's say, these individual spots that she's got here, what we would do is simply move our mouse over, make sure that we have a brush that's large enough to encompass this spot, and we would click. What the brush is doing is it's trying to make an average that surrounds that point of problem and clarifies a very specific thing. So if the image is, or if the problem is too large, you can start getting some very strange artifacts. Like that is a little bit too big. There's some other points that are a little bit too big. So if there's just a very unique, very specific blemish, the spot healing brush is actually a pretty great tool to use. Just like that or that, it works pretty well. It preserves the look of the skin without creating too many artifacts. Okay? We can use the general healing tool, which essentially means that we have to go in and we'll do something similar, but we have to define a place that we want to patch from. So instead of pulling an average of essentially what's around the tool, what we would do is go to a different part of the image, hold Alt to get this crosshairs, click, and now we are dragging that section, that clean section of skin, to another part of our image, and we would drop that off. So, for example, if I had this section up here where we have this blemish, I could go and say, okay, this skin is relatively the same color. I can move it up, drop it off right here, and the blemish is largely gone. The skin tone, the skin color is very similar here. So I was able to pull it from one place and put it in that other without too much of a trouble. I might be able to do the same thing right here. Select, move, drop. Let's try that one more time to clean it up even more. Select, pull, drop. So the original and cleaned up a little bit. So that's not a bad way of working. So that's the spot healing. The patch tool is another way of doing this, but it is even more dramatic. The patch tool allows us to go in and essentially say, I want to fix, I'm just clicking and drawing this area. And then what you do is grab in the middle and drag it around until you find a place that kind of works, and then when you let go, it will replace what was inside that area with the area that you just chose. Let's see that again. Let's decide on, how about this area? I'm not sure how well it will work, but I'm going to draw it just around the outside here. And then I'm going to drag this off and let's drop it off. Okay? Deselect. And I have largely covered up that area. Original, somewhat cleaned up. Okay? The patch tool is another option that we have at our disposal. Above this, there's one other tool that we could use to do the same thing. It's a little bit more of a heavy tool, and I avoid using it as much as possible just because it tends to do a little bit more than I am usually comfortable with, and that is called the clone stamp tool. The clone stamp tool. The clone stamp works very similarly to the healing brush, but what it does is it will essentially allow you to choose a place. For example, if I wanted to choose, and I'm going to show you how dramatic it is, if I chose here and moved somewhere else, when I click and hold, you'll see a crosshair on your screen down low. As I move my mouse up top, you'll notice the crosshair follows it down low and will clone whatever I am actually dragging over. So wherever I move my mouse up top, it will move the crosshair down low. Now that will work sometimes, but it also has the tendency to catch a lot of really weird artifacts at the same time. So we want to be very careful with the clone stamp tool. I would suggest the clone stamp is probably only used when your brush is very small and when you're doing very specific work. Like right here with this thing, I may go click here, move in, and then just very gently, very carefully color in that space so I don't cover up her lips anywhere. It can be used well, but you have to be very careful with it. Okay? So, original and cleaned up. Now we could do the same thing, for example, with these wrinkles, and the clone stamp might actually do well. For example, if I did this, now as I track, you'll notice the crosshair tracks underneath it, and I could just continue to draw. Continue to draw. Maybe make another selection and draw some more. It has a tendency to start looking odd after a while. So, for example, the original, the cloned. So that that is certainly something that would be a bit odd. This weird section here. So. What I probably want to do is find a better place to clone from. As I said, the clone stamp it can be used, but it also has the tendency to leave artifacts like this that we would want to avoid. So there's several different options for doing some airbrushing. I would suggest you play with them, find what works best for you, and as always, if you have any questions, let me know.